You're listening to the People Agenda podcast, brought to you by leading HR, workforce and payroll transformation specialist, Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris, from Lace Partners, joining you as always as we release the latest of our Thursday podcasts. And I hope you are well wherever you are and whatever you are doing. Now, today we are going to be talking about the UK budget because at the time of recording, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has recently announced some of the changes that were documented to be happening. If you listen to a lot of the press, I've not personally seen budget announcement that was as hotly anticipated as this one. Perhaps that's mainly because I've been paying more attention in recent years, but this one certainly got a lot of people's, I wouldn't say backs up, but it got a lot of people interested. And so what we wanted to do here at Lace is just get together with a couple of our experts to talk a little bit around the practicalities of what did actually come out of it and what are some of the things that HR professionals, chief people officers, people who run reward functions, payroll professionals, what are the sorts of things that maybe they want to pick up and have a look at and perhaps even start to plan for as well. And that's going to be the kind of red thread that runs through this podcast, is that planning stage as well, because some of the changes, as we'll talk about, come into effect straight away. In order to do this, I need a couple of experts, a couple of specialists, a couple of people in the know. Before I introduce them, just a caveat to you guys, we aren't tax specialists at Lace Partners. So what you're not going to get is chapter and verse of extreme detail on all levels of the taxation side of it. But we will give you practical advice, guidance and thoughts and things to think about as well. I'll introduce my guests. First and foremost, it's Mike Aldred from our reward team. Mike, how you doing? You all right?
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
And we've got Jeremy Hill, who is an associate of Lace Partners. Jeremy, how you doing? You good?
Yes, doing well. Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here.
Are you two super excited to get into the detail of this?
Probably more excited than the average listener on talking about national insurance and pensions. Yeah, no, it is the sort of thing that we're fascinated by.
Absolutely. Jeremy, is this going to blow your socks off talking about this?
I think what we want to be able to do here is to be practical. There's a lot of theory, as you say, we're not tax experts, but actually where this starts to become relevant is how is it actually going to affect people? How is it going to affect some of the employees? And therefore, what might organisations be doing?
Yeah, 100%. Let's get into it.
Plus, we're deeply nerdy, to be honest.
Yeah.
So we do enjoy it as well.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So let's get into some of the detail of it. And I guess I want to start off. I'll start off with you, Jeremy, and then Mike, you can chip in. But we just want to give a bit of a top line overview of some of the changes that have come out, how it's impacting payroll reward or HR teams as well. So do you want to give us a little bit of a helicopter side and then some of the simple terms, if you like, because there's always lots of detail that comes out of this, isn't it? And people spend a lot of time pouring through it and trying to digest it.
Chris, you're right. I think as we were leading up to the budget last week, there was a lot of debate, and we won't get into the politics of pre-releases and conversations that were taking place. Actually, in the end, I would say in our area of interest, there weren't any massive surprises because what we're going to talk about mostly today was quite heavily trailed beforehand. So specifically, we're going to talk about the impact on the pension contributions and specifically the salary sacrifice aspects of this. Broadly, there's been an opportunity through salary sacrifice to save on national insurance contributions, on the pension side of things. As one is making a pension contribution through a company arrangement, you can structure it so that salary sacrifice can take you out of the net of national insurance. And what the Chancellor has done in this announcement and confirmed in the budget was what had been anticipated, that there will in future be a cap on the amount of pension contribution that will be without national insurance. So it's a level of £2,000 of contribution above which national insurance will start to be paid. That's the broad picture. Actually, probably the most interesting thing that happened was that the implementation of this is not going to be until 2029, which in some respects feels like quite a long way away, gives lots of time for people to do planning. But in reality, as we start to think about the context in which this will sit from an overall reward perspective, it's actually not that far away. And there's action that companies and leaders in this space might want to be taking already.
Jeremy, can I just jump in as well? Because I think it's worth reminding everybody that whilst these changes are impacting the effectiveness from a national insurance perspective, then income tax treatment of the contributions is remaining unchanged. So the pension contributions will still benefit from the usual tax relief, subject to annual allowance or any other existing limits. So what's changed here is less effective from a national insurance perspective contributions via salary sacrifice over £2,000, but still effective from an income tax perspective. And that is worth noting. And general employer contributions that have not been made by a salary sacrifice, I'm right in thinking those have not been impacted. That's right, isn't it, Jeremy?
Yes, exactly. So I suppose just to get into a little bit more of the detail, as you say, Mike, there've largely been two approaches that companies might take when setting up pension contributions. And we're talking about defined contribution plans here. They might use the traditional method, you might say, which is to determine a level of contribution and to pay that out of income. In that situation, the income level, the salary, doesn't actually change. And so national insurance is paid on that salary. What some companies have taken advantage of is an alternative approach, which is the salary sacrifice approach, which in this instance effectively reduces the income, what one might call one's salary, in order to optimize the amount that's going into pension. Therefore, it means that your actual salary level comes down, and you can do the calculations and you can come out with the same sort of net payment being made. But if you're avoiding the national insurance on that slice of what was your total salary, it's actually going to be cheaper for the company. And it's that, what I think the Chancellor refers to as a loophole, the salary sacrifice approach, that she's placed a cap. And £2,000 is the maximum amount that can fall into this salary sacrifice approach without incurring national insurance. And the reality is that £2,000 actually in many cases is not actually that high a figure. So even if you're at 4% of £50,000, that's actually going to get caught. But anything above that would be caught. So,
Jeremy, can I just come back to one of the things you were saying? People have been referring to this as a loophole, which is curious, really, because actually it's been promoted as a mechanism to encourage pension saving. So to then start talking about it as a loophole, it perhaps gives an indication of some of the policy making behind this, and it is perhaps slightly worrying about salary sacrifice schemes in general going forward if they're being seen as loopholes, which is slightly problematic.
You're right that every time we come up to a budget, there's scaremongering or at least anticipation of what might get caught this time. Might it be higher rate pension tax relief and so on? And you're quite right to home in the sense that the income tax situation didn't get caught, as it were, didn't get changed. And this feels like chipping away at the edges. And I would agree with you. I think it seemed like an entirely legitimate approach to use salary sacrifice. I think there are examples where that usage has been extended. So the bonus waiver situation is one that is quite common in financial services, for example. And that will absolutely fall into this situation where this maximum will therefore mean that it's subject to national insurance. But it's only, I think you might say, a sort of slight reweighting of the tax and national insurance burden. And it doesn't actually mean that salary sacrifice is dead. What I think it does mean is that any organisation that's been using that approach will want to have another look and see how it actually impacts on their approach and the amounts that they're paying. Quite a lot of organizations in setting up a salary sacrifice approach will have used that national insurance saving possibly to pay for the implementation cost or actually to increase the amount that they're prepared to pay. And I think this is the main concern, that there will be organizations who actually want to redress the balance, as it were.
So, Mike, one of the things I'm just going to kick us on a second. One of the things I wanted to talk about is, Jeremy mentioned it and you mentioned it as well, this kind of timing wise and the 2029 piece, because I'd imagine there's businesses, particularly with the pace of change and with organizations having so much to focus on and concern with. I wonder if there's a danger of businesses thinking, that's a good 3 years away, we've got time yet. I don't know if you want to give us a minute or two of thoughts around why actually the timing is still relevant, and certainly relevant in the now as well, and what teams should be thinking about, what HR, what reward teams, what payroll teams should be thinking about in the now.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think it's fair that both Jeremy and I've observed separately, it's somewhat unusual to have such a long lead time to this sort of change. But when you reflect on it further, there is some sort of rationale for that, partly because whilst it sounds really simple, in practical terms, there is some technical complexity to be handled here and thought about. And of course, it's also easier in some ways to manage these sorts of changes when the pain of the impact is kicked down the road a little bit. But I think it is, as you were saying, important not to procrastinate and to use the time wisely in thinking about the impacts. I think there are both technical and operational impacts that need to be thought through. Jeremy, what's your view?
Yeah, I think I completely agree. Let's supposing an organisation actually feels they're going to need to make a change. Most of these salary sacrifice schemes are run through systems, we'd like to hope, not pen and paper and a spreadsheet. Those sort of changes typically take a year to get into place. So you've already come into 2028. You shouldn't be doing this in isolation. You should be thinking about the broader reward picture. That probably gives you another year ahead of that. So we're into 2027. So it's actually really not that far away. And the detail of this has not entirely been set out. So people will need a bit of time to work that out. I could see the 3 years going by pretty quickly.
Yeah. Can I then ask you, how many of the businesses that you either speak to or have been speaking to, how many of them are immediately in the aftermath of this? I'll start with you, Mike, and then get Jeremy's views. How many of them in the immediate aftermath are paying attention, or how many of them are taking the view that it's, do you know what, we've got time? Are you seeing that play out?
I think it's a little bit too soon to know. I think people are still
2 weeks. Yeah.
Are still digesting. What is true, though, that this cap of £2,000 is actually quite low. I would say surprisingly low. So we do expect it to buy, particularly on where employees are on, let's say, mid-range and above type salaries. These schemes are quite common. So, for example, quite a common, albeit considered modern approach to pensions to have flexible benefits. So you would see them increasingly common over the last decade or so. And so we will expect it to impact quite a lot of both employees and a lot of employing companies. So thinking through the impacts is a really important stage, and that's going to take some time. And there are also some sort of behavioural changes as well, and that will be a second order change. So it'd be really important to lean into the communications to help manage that. Do you agree, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've seen statistics that suggest that in larger companies, it's as many as 85% using salary sacrifice. And even smaller companies, it's probably 50%. One of the first things an organisation should be asking itself, I mean, if you're the CPO, would be actually, have we got this in place already? And I suspect, given that this was trailed, there are not many companies who are in the middle of introducing a salary sacrifice approach, but there may be some. Clearly, they're going to need to think again. But I would have said 50% or more of companies, this is going to have some impact.
Okay, so let's go into I'm a CPO right now, or I'm a head of reward, just listening into this pod. And I'm thinking, okay, I've got the bit of the detail on the salary sacrifice stuff that you guys have talked about. We've talked about a little bit around why you don't need to delay. This isn't a turn up at 2029 and suddenly start thinking you need to do something. Are there any kind of steps or any thoughts? I'll start with you, Jeremy, but then actually, no, I'll start with Mike again, just so that we can bounce in the right order. Any kind of steps or thoughts about what, if I'm listening now, I'm a CPO, I'm a head of reward, what can I do right now? What are the things that I need to be thinking of from tomorrow?
An immediate step would be to just understand the exposure. So first of all, identifying who's affected and by how much, and think about the quantifying this. And you could be using the data, for example, if you're running flexible benefits, to make this sort of assessment quite quickly. And you'd also want to identify where the impact is going to be particularly significant, and also if it's impacting any of your critical populations, so executive teams, for example, where you've got a concentration in terms of impacts. Step 2, I think, is a bit more into the financial modelling. Do you want to pick that up, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think this would be to look at across the different strata of the population, how much is the impact going to be? Because an approach to this would be to say, okay, there's an additional cost that's not so significant, or actually practically it's something that we would accept as an organization. I actually think that that's only going to be applicable for those for whom the impact is marginal. I think for many organizations, this will actually have quite a significant impact at higher levels, particularly. And they're going to want to think again about the overall perspective of this pension contribution as part of the broader reward package.
Yeah. And then one of the things that we've done is, just as a pre-read to this, Mike, one of the things I know that you've mentioned as an additional step there is around reward architecture and design. So can you just talk us a little bit through what we're talking about there?
Yeah, just before that, the other sort of mechanism in terms of the modelling, just to mention briefly, would be full redesign of the mechanisms to make contributions. And you might see where it isn't a marginal cost, you might see organisations either shifting some of the increased employer cost to the employees, or even withdrawing from salary sacrifice type approaches to less flexible approaches, which are based on fixed employer contributions, because obviously those contributions wouldn't be attracting the extra social security. But that's a very difficult transition to do, and actually carries some risk involved if you're doing it just to avoid tax. So Chris, you were also just asking about the reward architecture design. And I think when something really fundamental changes like this, it's important, in my view, not to just concentrate on the narrow technical question, but use it as an opportunity to do a bit of a step back. When the economic environment has changed, I think the smart thing to do here is think a bit more broadly about what you're trying to achieve with both your pensions, your benefits programs, and then how they fit into the bigger reward package. Because otherwise you could solve a series of very narrow technical questions and end up with something which doesn't really fit the commercial imperative in a more general sense. So we'd encourage people, yes, do the technical work to understand the technical detail about pensions, making sure you're understanding the impacts. But when it comes to thinking about solutions, think more broadly about your overall reward proposition, the part you want pensions to play, and then think about how you respond to the changes in this technical detail. I think you end up with using that approach with a far more balanced perspective. And for example, it may be that it is still a very sensible thing to retain flexibility. Yes, you might be losing some of the salary sacrifice, but as part of the overall balance of the reward package, that might be a sensible thing. On the other hand, you might be using salary sacrifice, for example, as a way of tax effectively delivering some of the variable compensation because of the interactions with bonus plans. There, clearly, you might need to take a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, and there's probably still, I think there's the angle here that this changes the equation. It doesn't necessarily invalidate the solution entirely. So in practice, it's not as tax effective as it previously was, but it may still be the more effective route, particularly when you combine it, you look at that bigger picture.
Yeah, certainly. I'm going to move us on because we've got a couple more steps that we need to get to. And so, Jeremy, one of the things obviously to think about as part of this is those payrollers as well and the systems that they need to look at, because there's that kind of practical side. So can you talk us a little bit through one of the steps that we walk through or we recommend looking at when it comes to that payroll and the systems and operational readiness side as well?
You're absolutely right. This is in many cases embedded. There's a whole infrastructure of systems that are going to interact. You'll have a flex system, you'll have a payroll system, you've got provider systems that you're interacting with. So any change that's going to take place needs to anticipate the potential impact on those different elements, which is why, as we said earlier, even though it might look like it's 3.5 years away, actually doing the analysis early is going to allow you a longer run to make the potential changes that are going to be necessary. So that would be do the analysis in terms of the pension side of things and do the parallel analysis in terms of the systems impact. And then you can actually potentially go up a level and think about the reward picture and then make a decision as to whether you're going to adjust the balance and then come back down into looking at solutions.
Yeah, and there's an element of needing to look at, okay, what does our system do at the moment? What will we might need it to do? And so do we need to actually start building like budget for payroll system upgrades or things like that? There's also the communications strategy part of this as well, isn't there, Mike? And that's a key part of this is telling your employees what you're doing, how you are evolving this, how this is being rolled out, how it impacts them, because ultimately this is going to be a massive, or it could be a big impact for some people. So do you want to just talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, Chris. And it's not just a matter of talking to the people who are impacted. One of the things that can worry people is just uncertainty. So being upfront and talking to people that aren't impacted and giving them reassurance that, you know, for them, nothing has changed. That's something that could easily be missed if you don't have a thought through communications plan. For those that are impacted, being really clear what the impact is, how it's come about, and to the extent that there's some flexibility that you're offering, if that's the course you're taking, setting out the choices that they have in front of them. I would say if there is a fairly common failing from people like me and technical experts, more technical than me, would be spending a lot of the time and resources thinking through all the fascinating detail, but not spending enough time thinking, how do we explain this in really clear terms so that people can understand it, demystify it for people, and help them through the change. And that's something that we would suggest people think very clearly about. It can be quite a simple thing to do, but if you haven't thought it through and you're doing it off the back foot, then, you know, that's where you end up with problems. And that would be my one takeaway. You don't want surprises for anybody. And we have got time to do this well. So there really is no excuse. And sometimes just being able to reassure people where there isn't an impact, that is also something that's quite important.
In some respects, you might say the good thing and the bad thing is that this has been quite high profile. I think, Chris, you said you were possibly more interested in this budget than previous ones, and I would say the same, just because we thought there might be surprises, and you might say that there were perhaps fewer surprises, but still the impact is there. And what it means is that it's probably in more people's consciousness than it would otherwise have been. Let's not pretend that everybody understands the detail of pension, and perhaps many people don't necessarily want to. They might have seen big pensions news, tax, national insurance, it's all changed. Actually getting on the front foot with them and saying, this is not something that's impacting us. Many people, I think, wouldn't actually know whether they were subject to this sort of arrangement at the moment or not. And so certainly if it's an organisation that is not using the salary sacrifice approach, then it's worth the reassurance, I think.
Yeah, it's still worthwhile communicating that stuff, even if it doesn't make an impact. And I think as well, one of the things that we talked about was we work with large organizations, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 person businesses. And communication is really key when you're rolling that out, an on-brand or a singular message to multiple employees across multiple different locations. But I think a big part of that as well is getting your governance, because when you've got these large organizations, you need to get the processes and the steps in place so that you can be able to communicate all of these changes, but then actually also have your plan in place. Mike, do you just want to touch on our thoughts around that kind of governance, board alignment, the things that you need to be thinking of as a business, particularly some of these larger businesses that we work with?
Yeah, so Remco members will also be listening to the news and will be aware of these changes, and they will have the question in their mind, okay, so what are we doing about it? You don't really want to be chased on this stuff. So I would suggest, as an early action, make sure that you make your MCOs aware that you have this issue in hand. And then in due course, you will want to take them through and show them the process you've gone through to systematically both think about the narrow issue, but remuneration committees will be interested in how you've thought about it more broadly. Clearly, they'll want to understand how you're managing the cost implications of this, how you're making sure that your reward is good value for money and you're getting the most out of it from a competitive point of view, and also thinking about the long-term financial management, not just of this issue, but as we said earlier, if this becomes the first of a number of steps around salary sacrifice in its various forms, then Remco would quite rightly want to see how are you planning to manage these types of issues as they emerge. So understanding the financial impact and also the direction of travel about how you're managing this type of issue in the long term. From our experience, we found that if you're very proactive in, again, your communication with Remco, showing that you're on top of the issue, that you've got a plan, you're working through it in a very systematic and organised way, then that's going to be extremely reassuring. They probably won't really want to get into all the detail, and that's probably quite right. But if you can give them that reassurance that you're on top of the issues and that you're managing the things that, from a custodian point of view, that are important to them, which is the financial impact and how it impacts employees, then they'll be really reassured and supportive on that. We need to just remember this is not a 2029 problem. It's an issue that requires activity now, and your Remcos and your boards will want to know what the plan is in order to manage that in a highly professional way.
And in a similar way that the employees, it's not necessarily exactly the same message, but that reassurance is important for those who are perhaps 5-10 years away from retirement. Actually, this could become quite a thing. If they've built their retirement planning around a particular level of contribution, about a particular approach, they're actually going to want to know early on that it's a subject that you've got under control, that you've got a process in place in order to address it and to find the best solution.
We're just on about half an hour, but I just want to do a kind of final, if there's anything, bits that we haven't picked up from some of this today, but really fascinating stuff. I really love the way in which you guys have broken down some of the steps, things to be thinking about if you're a CPO, if you're a head of reward. Certainly some interesting stuff there around the salary sacrifice. I think there was a lot of general, I was about to say use the word panic. It wasn't panic pre-budget, but there was a lot of concerned faces on the looks of many within UK PLC. But what's come out of it is, yes, some things to be aware of. There's some work and some planning that needs to happen. There's some checks and balances that you need to put in place, but nobody's setting fire to the furniture or anything. Mike, just any kind of final thoughts from you just as we wrap up today in terms of things that people can be thinking about?
The changes have changed the equation a little bit, but I'm not expecting this to be the death of flexibility in pensions. I think far from it. It will change the equation in terms of tax effectiveness. What I would say is one needs to take the opportunity, really, that this presents to think a bit more broadly and ask the fundamental questions about what are we trying to achieve with our pensions and benefits, and given these changes, do we need to pivot? I don't think it's a massive change of direction, but there might be some pivoting that needs to be done, and just understanding what that detail is. And don't forget the complex operational aspects of this and the need to be communicating both with the employee base, but also with your board about how you're managing through this. I think doing that removes quite a lot of the concern and uncertainty that arises from these types of changes, and helps you navigate through the change in a much more structured and thought through way.
Cool. Jeremy, any kind of final thoughts from your perspective?
I think flexibility is absolutely not dead, and the sort of individualization of benefits and indeed reward more broadly has been very much a trend. I think this slightly changes the balance between different aspects of that flexibility. And it may be indeed that companies will start to look perhaps across the benefit spectrum and see other things that people are interested in, whether it be healthcare or electric vehicles or other things. Just a little bit of a change, but I think it will absolutely continue to be a central part of that total reward offer, so that people are actually getting the right sort of savings and indeed the right sort of benefits across the whole picture.
That's pretty much us done for today. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for giving me a little bit of your time and talking through what I think it's been a fascinating topic in the lead up to it. It's been a little bit, again, I'm probably choosing my words poorly. I was going to say damp squib. It's not quite a damp squib in terms of some of the announcements, and there are things to think about. But certainly there are elements that organizations need to be considering, and certainly we'd be happy to have a chat with them if they wanted to talk to us about their approach to reward, payroll, and the impact of some of this budget as well. But Jeremy, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And Mike, thank you very much.
Very good.
Hopefully you've enjoyed listening to this podcast as much as we enjoy recording these. And if you do, then please feel free to subscribe, leave us some reviews on wherever the locations are that you get your podcasts. But from myself, from Mike, and from Jeremy, thank you very much for joining us. And we'll catch you next time on The People Agenda. Bye-bye.